Hello, my name is Andrew Rufner from Axim Global, and I will be your presenter today for this webinar in the Axim Global webinar series. In this webinar, we will cover the new EU NIS Directive. Before I head into the presentation, just a few quick comments in terms of housekeeping. So you will be muted throughout the call. If you have questions in your webinar client, you have a question section, and I would encourage you to post those questions if you have any. My colleague who's listening in will collate all of these questions so I can answer them at the end of the presentation where we've got a Q&A section. I would also like to make everybody aware of the fact that this webinar is being recorded, and we will make the recording of this webinar with a couple of links available on our YouTube channel, probably with about 48 hours of today's webinar. And then ultimately, I'd like to invite you all to join us on social media, on LinkedIn and Twitter, for new webinar announcements and additional information if you would like. With that having been covered, let's head straight into it. So the agenda for today is, we'll start off with, first of all, looking at what is NIS anyway. So what is this EU NIS framework? Does this directive, what does it cover, and what is it trying to achieve? We'll then have a look at the state of the implementation. So how far is the implementation at this point in time? And then obviously, I guess what many of you are interested in as well is who's affected and what does it mean for you? And here we will very specifically look at the parties that are affected under the regulation directly, which will have to comply with this new directive, but also more broadly, how does the industry and how can we, as organizations and even individuals potentially, benefit from what is being done here. And then we'll ultimately summarize, and then I'll, as I said, head into a Q&A. So let's start off with what NIS actually is. NIS stands for the EU Network Information Security Directive. So this is a framework, the first piece of cybersecurity regulation that has been issued by the EU. That's unique. One could probably argue this is a little bit late, but nevertheless, it is the first piece of cybersecurity legislation that has been released by the EU. It was adopted in the EU Parliament in 2016, and as is always the case with EU regulation, there's then a period between it being passed at an EU level and it being transposed into national law, which is the process that we've just been through. So the NIS directive was passed into national law, and the deadline was May this year. So at this point in time, all EU member states have passed the directive into national law. And the NIS directive will, as we'll see in a minute, has got a couple of components, and it places very specific requirements on the EU itself, on the member states, and also high-risk sectors. So the NIS directive, what does it consist of? And it's got three fundamental parts that are probably important to understand. The first part of it is it deals with the build-up of national capabilities. Now, many of the member states have got national capabilities already, quite substantial, as we'll see later on in the presentation. But nevertheless, the EU NIS directive mandates that member states build cybersecurity capabilities and appoint an organization that is responsible for monitoring and driving implementation. So the NIS directive has placed very specific requirements on member states to build cybersecurity capabilities. So as an example, they must have a cybersecurity incident response team. They must participate in cyber exercises, etc. And at the same time, the EU builds capabilities as well. So component number one deals with what the member states need to put in place. The second big component of the directive talks about the level of cross-border collaboration between EU member states as it relates to cybersecurity, as well as the build-up of a EU CSIRT, which acts as a coordinating entity and also a cooperation group that goes with it. And obviously, that entity will also start to cooperate with other players outside of the EU or outside of the government organizations. And then last but not least, there is national supervision of critical sectors. And that has basically got two components. So the critical sectors are being defined or separated in two major groups. We've got critical industry sectors or infrastructure sectors. That's got to do with energy, transport, water, etc., banking, but also telecommunications infrastructure, which is considered to be critical EU infrastructure. And then important digital service providers are a separate group that's affected under the regulation as well. And those could be examples, could be search engine providers, online commerce, etc. So it's important to understand that this first piece of EU cybersecurity legislation basically deals with, on the one hand side, build up of capabilities. So it's all about building up capabilities at a national level and at an EU level, and starting to define the way that the cooperation goes on and also reporting goes on, as we'll see in a minute, as it relates to cybersecurity incidents. And then the second big component, if you will, deals with, in the first phase, protection regulation related to the protection of critical infrastructure. And those are also the sectors and the organizations that are directly affected by the directive, in the sense that they will need to comply. So if we look at the two categories in a little bit more detail and the requirements that are being placed on them, and then, as mentioned earlier, there's the critical category of so-called critical market operators, which basically deal with critical infrastructure. So again, I mean, we can imagine energy there. So we got the electrical grid, oil and gas, transport, seems obvious, air, rail, water, road, etc. Obviously, anything to do with financial services, health, also very important, and health is increasingly being targeted with cybersecurity attacks as well. And I think we've just seen a recent attack in Singapore with Sing Health. Water infrastructure, and then, as said, digital infrastructure, so internet exchanges, telecommunications operators, etc. These operators have to provide a clear view as to how they're going to protect themselves against cybersecurity threats, and they will have to put in place respective infrastructure. They will have to report on their efforts, and they will also have to report on all of the incidents. So these are the organizations that are going to be monitored by the national authorities, and they will have to comply directly and in a quite stringent fashion with the NIS directive. And they will also have to notify the authorities of any cybersecurity incident, which is substantially different to what we've got in place in many of the member states today. The second category that has far less stringent requirements, but nevertheless is mentioned under the NIS directive and affected, are digital service providers. So they don't necessarily need to disclose incidents. They definitely do not need to disclose details of incidents. But examples of these are online marketplaces, increasingly important, of course, cloud computing services, search engines, and the likes. And these will then be identified by the national authorities. So it's important to understand, as we're looking at the critical backbone that's being protected and being affected directly under the NIS directive, we've got two key categories. One of it is critical infrastructure, and the other one are digital service providers, large and important digital service providers. Those are the organizations that are directly affected by the NIS directive and will have to comply. So a question that I get asked quite frequently is, do we need NIS? And I think the answer is a definite yes. These kind of articles, I think we've all seen in the news over the years, and we're getting used to it. It's just a fact of life, and it's a global problem. This is by no means a European problem or an American problem or an Asian problem. This is a global problem. So whether we're looking at threats to the U.S. nuclear power grid, as we're looking at, as I mentioned, the recent hack of Sing Health, or the Port of Rotterdam that was affected a while back by a ransomware attack, which shut down part of the harbor. This is a global problem that we're all affected by. And fundamentally, the more effective that we deal with threats and protect ourselves against it, the better for all of us as individuals and as citizens, but also for all of us as organizations as we operate within this economic area. So then the second question that I get asked quite frequently is, as with any EU regulation, does this thing actually have teeth? And I think the answer is yes, but. So I think the first thing to understand here is, as I mentioned before, the threat is real. We know that the threat levels are increasing. We know that the threats are substantial. We know that cybercrime is a very profitable business, so it's something that's not going to go away quickly. And I think it's also clear that, as with many other domains of fighting against crime, a concerted approach is definitely better than a fragmented one. So by putting requirements on national authorities to actually put in place capabilities and putting in coordination at an EU level, it's definitely going to benefit all of us. And that's exactly, as I said, what the NIS Directive mandates. So it mandates very specifically that member states nominate what they call a national competent authority. So that's a single authority per member state that is responsible for the implementation of the NIS Directive. That it builds up national capabilities, an CERT or CSIRT, that the national bodies actually cooperate in a structured manner at an EU level, and then obviously consequently beyond that as well. That these national competent authorities supervise the protection of critical sectors, so they identify them and then they monitor the protection of those two key industry sectors, and obviously that they also then deal with all of the reporting of critical incidents. So, as mentioned before, the critical infrastructure providers are required under the directive to report any security incident they may face. The directive also creates room for penalty. So we are early in the implementation, and we will see how this will ultimately pan out. And the directive is not as specific as, for example, the GDPR, the Data Privacy Directive has been. But nevertheless, it does state that penalties, if they are issued, must be effective, proportionate, and dissuasive, which clearly means that we can expect those penalties, if they are applied, to be quite substantial, given the fact that the organizations that are affected and have to comply with the NIS regulation are generally quite large organizations as well. And then it's also important here to understand that these organizations that are affected under the regulation can be asked and will be asked to provide details on how they are going about protecting their infrastructure. And as I said, they will also have to report all of the incidents, which will help the authorities understand to what extent those efforts that have been put in place and those measures are sufficient, and what the threat level actually is. And that coordination can then help ensure that there's a less fast spread of effects from a cybersecurity threat. So does the NIS Directive have teeth? I think it does. I mean, it's a first step, clearly, but the fact, again, that it talks about and it requires a build-up of capabilities. It very clearly identifies particular sectors that are exposed, and it mandates that they put measures in place, which it then also monitors. And it's also got a stick at the end of the day with penalties that can be applied. Definitely means that it's got teeth. How it will be applied, I think time will tell, and we'll cover later on the state of the implementation. So we're still really relatively early in the implementation phase. So where are we then in the implementation? The NIS directive was passed in 2016 by the EU Parliament, and then has been handed over to the national entities to transpose it into national law, which the deadline was May this year. So at this stage, all of the EU member states have transposed the directive into national law and are starting to build out the capabilities. There was also a deadline last month for the identification of all of the operators of essential services. So that has happened as well, to the extent that they weren't known beforehand, and we're now in the implementation phase, in the early stage of the implementation phase, but in the implementation phase nevertheless. The state of the implementation obviously differs by member state. Because this has been handed down to the member states to implement, there are different ways that this is being implemented. There are different levels of maturity throughout the European Union in terms of how far the member states were before the directive. So the state of the implementation and the speed and the way that this is being done is different by member state, but nevertheless, we are now in the implementation across the EU. If you are an organization that is affected by the NIS directive, or you're unsure about it, you should definitely contact your national competent authority at this stage. So if you're on the call wondering whether you are affected and you're not sure about it, then this is something that you should probably do and reach out. It's interesting to see also that the EU publishes a lot of the information. So if you're interested in understanding more about in detail what the regulation entails, the European Union website is quite extensive on NIS. So you will find obviously all of the text related to the regulation of the directive itself. There's a lot of additional information that's available on that website. So I would definitely encourage anybody who's interested in understanding in a little bit more detail to head over to the EU website, and I'll put the link into the recording when I publish it on YouTube as well. So you've got all of these links there too. And then there's also an interactive map there, and I'll put that link online afterwards as well. That shows you the state of the implementation per member state. So as the implementation continues, you will be able to, from a single point of view or a single dashboard, understand where the different member states are. But let's have a look at a couple of examples. So I've just picked 3 random examples that are a little bit closer to me and a little bit easier for me to talk about. Specifically, I picked the Netherlands, Germany, and Belgium as examples, just to give you an idea as to where these are. So starting with the Netherlands, this is one of the countries that has had cybersecurity capabilities in place for quite a while, way before the NIS directive even was passed. So the Dutch NCSC has been quite active, and it has quite actively been coordinating across all of the different services, but it has also been quite active in reaching out to the industry and to enterprises within the Netherlands and working with them in a proactive fashion. So the NCSC has also been appointed as the national competent authority now for the implementation of the directive in the Netherlands. But here's an example of one of the member states that has got capabilities in place and is now using these capabilities to put in place the additional capabilities that are needed under the NIS regulation. Germany is very similar, albeit different than the Netherlands. Germany's BSE is the ministry that is responsible for information security. Has for many years been quite active in this space on information security, cybersecurity, etc. Again, way before the NIS regulation or directive even became into effect. And again, they've been appointed as the NCA, and they've got a national strategy that's published online, and they reach out quite actively to organizations and enterprises throughout Germany, but also consumers and small organizations, and they're doing that quite effectively. And then in Belgium, from a state of operation, even we've got the key players that have been identified. So the Belgium Center for Cybersecurity has been appointed as the NCA. They have already identified all of the infrastructure players, and these providers of essential services have now been given a 12-month period to come up with their information security policy, which they will need to present to the NCA, and then they will have another 12 months after that to implement all of these measures to be compliant with the NIS directive by November 2020. So that gives you a bit of a view also on the timeline, and again, where the implementation is with this country. Other countries are on different schedules, but all of this information is available online, and all of these information is available in English as well. So you don't have to worry about whether you speak German or Finnish or Greek or whatever. If you head over to that website, all of this information is available in English. So if you're interested, it's all there. Challenges and concerns. There are definitely challenges, as one can imagine, and there are definitely concerns as it relates to NIS as well. So for starters, from all of the publications that I've researched, also leading up to this webinar, I think it's quite obvious that there's a consensus that the NIS directive is an important one. It's obviously late, but it's an important step in the right direction. Yet, even though it is an important step and it's a step in the right direction, there's definitely concerns that are raised by a range of organizations, as you can imagine, and as is always the case with these kind of initiatives. But what I'd like to do is maybe just focus on a couple of practical concerns that have been raised, some of which I think are definitely reasonable concerns. So one of the concerns, for example, that's been raised here is that there's no requirement for organizations affected under the NIS regulation to comply with relevant international frameworks or best practices. So, for example, there is no need under NIS for the organizations that are affected by the regulation to comply with, for example, ISO 27001, which, if you're in information security, is something that would make you wonder why you wouldn't want to make sure that these organizations actually comply with this framework, given that this is the best practice framework that's quite widely used in the industry. But be that as it may, that's definitely something that hasn't happened. There's concern also that the national approaches will lead to different speeds, different approaches, different means of reporting, which will make it more difficult to deal with incidents. And then obviously that national jurisdiction will also complicate dealing with incidents and as well. So I think that that's just a consequence of the structure of the EU. It's a valid concern, and I think we can only hope that throughout the implementation, the organizations will collaborate in such a way as to make this the most effective as possible. As I mentioned, there's also concerns related to the different reporting requirements on incidents and the level of information that needs to be disclosed at the national level. The NIS directive does not specify that. That's down to the national competent authorities to specify that. And again, that's a concern that's been raised. Obviously, that makes it more complicated to collate it at an EU level, and for multinational organizations, that makes it more complicated from an operational perspective. And then the last concern that I definitely see raised, and I think is a justified concern as well, is that if the security of the critical infrastructure and cybersecurity is such an important theme, how do organizations that are not directly affected by the regulation benefit from what's going on here? And the directive itself does not specify that in any way, shape, or form. However, and we'll talk about that in a minute, there's definitely ways for all of us, or the rest of us, if you will, to benefit from the efforts that are going on here at this stage. I think it's clear that while many of these concerns are justified, we will have to see throughout the implementation phase how this ultimately evolves, and I'm confident that at least to an extent these issues and concerns will be dealt with throughout the implementation. So who's affected by the NIS directive, and what does it mean to all of us? As I'm pretty sure you understand by now, the organizations that are directly affected are the operators of critical infrastructure and the nominated or named digital service providers. They are directly affected under the NIS directive, and they will be asked by the national competent authorities to comply with the regulation. So, and they will have to put very specific measures in place. And if you think that you are in that category and you haven't been contacted yet, I would definitely advise that you reach out to your respective NCA. But the rest of us are obviously equally affected by cyber threats, and we can benefit from the efforts underway. And if you are concerned about cybersecurity, and I think any organization in this day and age should be, I would definitely encourage you to engage with at least with your national NCA, and look at what they do and how they work together with the industry and what they provide in terms of services. And you can even go cross-border and have a look at what others are doing as well. And again, two just very brief examples of initiatives that or things that you can benefit from today already are the Dutch NCSC, as an example, has got a coordinated vulnerability disclosure guideline that reaches out and allows you to disclose vulnerabilities if you have them, and then also gets fed back in a controlled fashion. So that's definitely something that's interesting to look at. And this is just one of the many examples that are out there. Or a very different example is the UK NCSC that publishes weekly threat reports with associated recommendations. So if you're trying to understand, what the threat levels are, what the new threats are, then this is another good example of information that is readily available to anybody globally, free of charge, that you can benefit from today. And then ultimately, of course, as citizens, we benefit from the efforts as well, as hopefully our infrastructure becomes more secure as part of this initiative. But for businesses, it's important to understand that even though you're not directly affected under this initiative, there are a lot of services out there today, and there's going to be a lot more down the line. So it's important to continue to watch at least your NCA, your national NCA, and even engage, if you will, to make sure that you can benefit from all of the efforts. So what should you do? I think, NIS or not, what is important definitely is to continue to maintain and increase awareness in your organization at all levels as it relates to cyber threats. These threats are real. They are growing. They're becoming increasingly sophisticated. This is an industry that is earning a lot of money, and they are becoming very, very sophisticated in the way that they're creating or organizing their attacks. So you should definitely make sure that you got awareness within your organization, and you maintain it at all levels, and you take the respective measures. I would definitely encourage everybody also to follow at least the development at your national level, if not other levels, and there's many organizations out there, as I said, that publish threat intelligence and provide that kind of information. So if you're responsible for cybersecurity, or if you're interested in it, then I would definitely suggest that you start to engage in a more proactive fashion, and that you follow those organizations, because there's a lot of very good information out there that you can use today. And then for smaller organizations, that is definitely more difficult, but you should then, in that case, seek professional support. And that doesn't have to be expensive, and it doesn't have to be difficult. There is an increasing number of organizations that pull this threat intelligence together for you and publish it. And there's also an increasing amount of suppliers that even integrate a large component of this with your infrastructure. So large portions of it can be automated, but you should definitely take this seriously, and you should definitely look at it. You should definitely also have a look at your infrastructure and make sure that you've got an up-to-date infrastructure. You've got all the components and the processes in place, as well as the skills. And if you can't afford the skills because you're too small, then again, turn to professional organizations to help you with that. And for those of you that are interested in what this actually means, what the frameworks look like, and what a sort of a no-nonsense way of building out that infrastructure could look like, I would definitely encourage you to go and have a look at 2 of the recent Axim Global webinars, one of which covered the MITRE attack framework, which is a sort of a common open attack framework, which I think pretty sure you'll find very interesting, which was presented by Joshua Williams, an industry veteran. And then we've also got one that is on no-nonsense cybersecurity that was presented by Sean McAllister, a gentleman with a resume in U.S. intelligence services, a technical director of many of the key organizations that you will recognize. That has got a very impressive CV and has got a very reasonable approach that is suggesting that I think is effective even for small organizations as to how to deal with these kind of threats. So if you are interested in this, if you're wondering, how to do this in a reasonable fashion, that also an SME organization can handle, I would definitely suggest that you head over and have a look at those webinars as well. And last but not least, don't take the eye off the ball. It is important to you to understand that this threat is real. And there are organizations out there that we've been working with that have been affected by cyber threats quite substantially. So it is important to understand that the threat is real, to plan for an incident, make sure you've got measures in place, and just hope that you never need them. But it is important to understand what can happen, to plan for it. And again, that's where reaching out to national competent authorities and national organizations can also help you bring in some of the knowledge and intelligence that you need. And hopefully, as the rollout of the NIS Directive continues, we should see more of these tools and capabilities become available. Okay, so that's a brief introduction to NIS and what it means, and also what it means for us if you are not an organization that's directly affected under the regulation. So in terms of questions and answers, I see that we've got a couple of questions here, so I'll just take them one by one. If you've got any additional questions, please feel free to put them in your question window, and I'll try and address them to the best of my knowledge. So question number one is if I'm not an affected provider, why should I care about NIS? I would have hoped that I've answered that question throughout the presentation, but basically, if you're not a critical market operator or digital service provider, cybercrime will still affect you, and it is a threat to all of us. So as a result, I would definitely suggest that you continue to follow the developments, and you should care about NIS basically because of the results that it provides. It will help secure the infrastructure, the core infrastructure that you use as a business anyway. And secondly, it will hopefully spawn threat intelligence and best practices that we can all benefit from. So, and the national competent authorities, again, are one of the places that I would definitely suggest that you start. And it will basically just help you be even more effective to fight cybercrime for your organization. The second question I got here is, does NIS also affect foreign companies? Obviously, since it's an EU directive, it doesn't. But if you are a subsidiary of a EU organization that is affected, so let's say you're in financial services and you're in an overseas subsidiary of an organization that is affected under the EU NIS regulation, then you may be affected as well. So this very much depends on whether you're a multinational and whether the organization that you work for is considered to be a critical market operator or a digital service provider. And if so, you may be indirectly affected by NIS even if you are not within the EU. Another question here was, it seems like the NIS implementation has only just started, so what's in it for me? Yes, I mean, that's correct. The implementation has started. And as I said when I was responding to the first question, I mean, the implementation is only just underway. More capabilities will become available, but the directive itself has created a framework which makes it more clear, at least for the rest of us also, where to turn in case that we do need help. And I would just suggest here that you continue to follow that process quite carefully, and you reach out proactively. And what's in it for you then is basically that you get a lot of free services that are provided to you by those different authorities and are partially developed under this NIS directive. So again, it's something that we all will need to follow, but there's definitely benefits for all of us. Next question here is, I'm in an affected industry and operate in different EU countries. What now? Yeah, that's a good question. So as I alluded to in the presentation, there's definitely a concern from a multinational perspective that if you're operating in different member states, because the implementation has been handed down to the NCAs, we might see different rules in different countries. And I think the only thing that you can do at this stage really is to be proactive about it. As we're early in the implementation, this is the right moment to reach out to those NCAs and raise concerns to the extent that you have them, try and understand where they are, and work with them and make them aware of potential challenges that you may face with the implementation. Again, I think these are all concerns that are voiced by a number of players, but the way to deal with it, in my view, is to try and get ahead of it and work with these NCAs to address them while we're going through the early phases of the implementation. I got a question here. We are a non-EU entity. It seems like this is irrelevant to us. Yes and no, I would say. I mean, yes, to the extent there's nothing for you to comply with. So if you're not based in the EU, if you are not a subsidiary of an EU entity that is affected under NIS, then you're obviously not affected by the directive directly. But again, as it relates for the rest of the industry within the EU, even for organizations outside of the EU, the capabilities that are being built up here and the information that's being shared and the best practices that are partially shared already today, and you saw the examples that I showed, and there's more that will definitely become available as the implementation proceeds, will benefit everybody. So whether you are based in the EU or whether you are not based in the EU, if cybersecurity is a concern, then I would suggest that you at least aim to follow what's going on over here, as well as obviously also any of your national organizations. So there's definitely benefits, I guess, for all of us across the board. Okay, these are all of the questions that I've had. If there are no more questions, then I guess all that remains for me to do at the moment is to thank you very much for your time and for attending this webinar, and to invite you to follow us on Twitter or on LinkedIn, where we publish articles regularly, and we will obviously also publish invitations to new webinars. We're planning a whole range of webinars starting next year again on cybersecurity related themes, as well as fraud. So I would definitely invite you to follow us on social media. Thanks again for taking the time, and I look forward to hopefully seeing you again on a future webinar. Thank you very much, and goodbye.